think we should start, and we can start. Welcome everyone at home and from your offices all over the world. Great pleasure to welcome you to yet another edition of our seminar in Digital and Public Humanities. And before I introduce you to today's guest speaker, Sam Huskey from Oklahoma University, just some practical advices. So this seminar is being recorded and will be, if it's okay with you, Sam, published on YouTube. We have a YouTube channel where all the seminars are uploaded and accessible. If you have slides to share, we can upload them to our GitHub website or GitHub repository, so people don't have to take notes and can get back to the material that you use and with references and stuff. We will have, after the presentation, there will be a discussion. You can use the chat to just indicate to me that you want to ask a question or make a comment, or you can, even if you have problems with audio, you can also write your question into the chat and I can read it or someone else can read it. And yeah, in general, so preferred English today, but we can also have synchronized translation, interpretation immediately. That shouldn't be a problem. Anything else? No, I think that regards the formalities. Thank you to Stefano D'Aglio, Elisa Corot, and Deborah Paci, who are organizing this cycle of seminars, and there will be another following in spring next year. Today's speaker, I'm very glad to introduce you to Samuel Huskey, who received his Ph.D. in classics from the University of Iowa and is now a professor at the Department of Classics and Letters at the University of Oklahoma. He directs the Digital Latin Library. This will also be a part of the subject he will be presenting today, a project supported by the Mellon Foundation and a collaborative effort of important North American associations, so the Society for Classical Studies, the Medieval Academy of America, and the Renaissance Academy of America. And his personal topics, so the topics of his personal research and publications include poets of the Augustan age, especially Ovid's exile poetry and the technique of allusion. So I wonder if you will take advantage of this technique in your presentation. We will see. You're also working on Boccaccio, on its bucolic poetry, and in recent times, or since a couple of years now, very much also at the intersection of philology with digital technology, so digital philology, if you like, and the evaluation of digital scholarship. And this is why we invited you to this seminar series, and we're happy to have you here today with us. Today you will speak about what is digital Latin, an overview of the Digital Latin Library. So thank you very much, Samuel, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for that warm introduction. I really appreciate it. And you also took care of my second slide, in fact, which is talking about the support that I've received from the Mellon Foundation, the University of Oklahoma, the SCS, MAA, and RSA. So I appreciate that. Franz, are you able to hear me okay?
Yeah, I'm hearing you, and if we get into complications technical wise, I will interrupt you. But I put myself on mute, so in order to okay, everything is fine. We will let you know if something seems not to be working.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
The title of my paper today plays on the overuse of the adjective digital as a shorthand for technological sophistication. So often, it seems that we call something digital out of laziness, or to attract the interest of a younger generation, or to appease administrators who are entranced by STEM, or to court funding agencies that are eager to be on the cutting edge. Digital humanities is an excellent example, since it's so broadly applicable as to be notoriously difficult to define. And yet, I direct the Digital Latin Library, so it is clear that I'm part of the problem. And since the DLL also publishes the Library of Digital Latin Texts, I'm guilty of doubling down on the notion that digital Latin is somehow different from regular Latin. Obviously, the title of this presentation is a deliberate misreading of the title of the Digital Latin Library and its Library of Digital Latin Texts. But the misreading offers us an opportunity to interrogate the word digital, at least as it applies to these projects. My goal with this presentation then is to explore what digital Latin might be, with a view to clarifying what the word digital signifies in connection with my project, if not digital humanities research and scholarship in general. Before I delve into the meaning of digital Latin, I must therefore describe the key problem the DLL was established to solve. Then, after discussing the idea of digital Latin in general, I'll use some examples from the DLL's project to demonstrate how a digital approach to Latin texts can connect Latin's analog past with a possible digital future. Latin texts have been available in one digital format or another for as long as people have been working on computers. But apart from some notable exceptions, Catullus Online and Musisque Deoque, for example, a key component has been missing from those texts: the critical apparatus, those lines of abbreviations, symbols, and words in Latin in a critical edition where editors communicate, often laconically, information about variant readings, conjectures, and other items of interest. The reasons for the omission of this information from online texts are many. Some argue that the text of an ancient author is in the public domain, but the critical apparatus and all of the other parts of a critical edition are protected by the editor's or the publisher's copyright. Others have surrendered to the technical difficulties of representing the critical apparatus in a digital format. And some, to be sure, simply never used the critical apparatus in the first place, so they don't miss it. But it is a loss, for it means that readers who encounter Latin texts online will be led to believe, erroneously, that those texts have a greater claim to authority than they really do. After all, a critical apparatus reveals the relative strength or weakness of the evidence for the text. That might not make a difference to a casual reader, but no serious scholarship can be accomplished in the absence of such information. Accordingly, professional scholars must continue to use volumes published by the few presses that value textual scholarship. And since the market for critical editions is small, the cost of those volumes is high, which in turn puts scholarship out of the reach of many readers. The Digital Latin Library was established in large part to address these issues. Our mission has been to develop a platform for creating, publishing, and using open source, open access critical editions of Latin texts. In pursuit of that mission, we have developed a system for representing critical editions as machine-readable data, workflows for encoding the data, a process for subjecting that data to quality control through the time-honored tradition of peer review, and of course, the applications for visualizing, printing, and interacting with the text. All of that work has led me often to ponder the idea of digital Latin and whether it really is different from the editions, codices, and manuscripts that we have encountered up to this point. The answer, I have found, is all a matter of perspective. Because critical editions have traditionally taken the form of a book, we've become used to thinking of them as items that we can hold in our hands and read. We have also become used to the many visual cues that communicate different kinds of information to us. From the layout of their pages with the text on top and the apparatus at the bottom, to different typefaces and the use of special abbreviations and symbols, critical editions demand a lot of hermeneutical effort from the readers, especially since there is usually nothing in the text to alert them to the presence of supplementary information. Because we've become so accustomed to those efforts, editors tend to think in those terms. That is, they concern themselves with whether to use round parentheses, square brackets, angle brackets, curly braces to communicate one thing or another. They obsess over the details of the layout of their edition and whether their use of capital letters or blank space will communicate their point adequately. Editions of complicated texts, such as Servius's commentaries on the works of Virgil, are extreme examples. The edition by Thilo and Hagen communicates much through typographical conventions, especially italic type and expanded spacing. Rand's edition uses spacing margins. Rand's edition uses spacings, margins, and vertical bars to indicate which strand of the Servian commentary is present for a particular passage. In short, editors put thought into every aspect of the page of a critical edition, whether it is part of the text or a rich signifier of information about the text. It surprises many of these editors and readers to learn that when they use the conventions I have just described, they are engaged in the acts of visually encoding and decoding texts. For example, when editors want to communicate that some text is irredeemably corrupt, they surround the passage in question with daggers, for example, a crux. That is a kind of visual instruction to readers who understand what those daggers mean. Similarly, a series of asterisks typically indicates a lacuna, and underdots can indicate letters that have been erased or whose transcription is uncertain. Unfortunately, only human readers who have sight can reliably interpret those instructions. If the same text is fed to a computer without any further instructions for processing it, the computer will recognize the input as just another string of characters. A central aim of the DLL and other projects like it is to make texts meaningful to computers too, so that humans can harness computational power to do things that they would not otherwise be able to do. So let's consider now what digital Latin might be. If we take the term digital broadly to mean associated with computer technology, then digital Latin could include a piece of paper with the contents I've projected on the screen. That's just the word Latin represented in binary digits. I'm not seriously suggesting this as a basis for discussion. Such a text will be of limited use to most people, since the content is not actually in Latin, and binary to text converters would be required for a normal human to understand the significance of those number sequences. But it does illustrate how capacious the term digital Latin can be. My binary example also introduces a fundamental tension that does not apply to traditional texts in print, the tension between human and machine readers. I use the word tension because humans and machines often have competing interests where data are concerned. Both of these two types of readers engage in the interpretation of symbols, but most of the time those symbols have very different meanings. Most humans will see the zeros, ones, and spaces in the binary code for Latin as meaningless unless they have the information they need to decode them into a recognizable word. Depending on their hermeneutical proclivities, they might then investigate the significance of the text, perhaps as a commentary on the distance between human and machine. But my computer must decode the example too. Although it is already in binary code, which should be easy for a machine to read, my computer is using binary code to represent each of the individual ones, zeros, and spaces on the screen. In fact, the binary code for my binary example is that. Obviously, this line of thinking is endlessly recursive, so I won't take it any further. My binary Latin, then, requires both humans and machines to do some work before the text makes sense to them. Even then, the text is not particularly useful to either one. It seems to me that we've arrived at the beginnings of a definition for digital Latin. It should be a text in a form that both humans and machines can use, preferably in a way that leverages the unique capabilities of both. Let's test that definition with some examples of how people encounter Latin texts on a computer. Is a digital image of a Latin manuscript digital Latin? On the one hand, no, it's not. It is rather a collection of electronic data that represent a real-world object. In that regard, it is not much different from an actual photograph. A human might be able to read the Latin captured in the image, and, as scholars such as Uwe Springmann have demonstrated, it is possible to train a machine to do the same. But the image is no more digital Latin than an image of a dog is a digital dog. On the other hand, yes, it is digital Latin. After all, it is a digital representation of an artifact that contains Latin writing. It leverages the ability of a computer to read and assemble information necessary to render an image onto a screen. That makes it possible for a human to view the image and understand things about the object that the image represents. The human can also use the computer's processing power to alter the image by enlarging it, reducing it, focusing on a particular section, or removing colors or adding other things. Now, just to step away from my presentation for a moment, what you're looking at is part of a colophon in a manuscript copied by the scribe Tommaso Baldinotti. And I was interested in trying to figure out what those lines that have been scratched out actually say. I had a Department of Criminal Investigation use their technology to photograph this manuscript. And I eventually figured it out, but I won't bore you with it. There's a reason he scratched it out. It's not that interesting. So indeed, Latin scholars have been clamoring for years to have access to digital images of manuscripts, preferably free access, so that they can do their work without traveling far and wide to consult the collections of multiple libraries. So it's clear that a digital image of a Latin manuscript is a valuable resource. Moreover, it meets the requirements of being in a form that both humans and machines can use, in a way that leverages the unique capabilities of both. Is a PDF of a 19th century edition of a Latin text digital Latin? On the one hand, a PDF is a poor substitute for a book that it seeks to reproduce. Anyone who has ever had to scroll through hundreds of pages of a PDF knows how much easier it is to flip through the pages of a book. But a poor substitute is still a substitute, and there can be no doubt that PDFs have enhanced scholars' access to research materials. Moreover, a PDF can be processed with optical character recognition software so that its text can be searched. Indeed, I've had some success searching for Latin words and phrases in HathiTrust's database of PDFs. Nevertheless, as far as digital Latin goes, PDFs leave much to be desired in terms of the use and reuse of their contents. The problem is that they are a kind of bridge technology. That is, they endeavor to preserve the form and appearance of pages in a real-world object, such as a book. In that sense, they are similar to the digital images I mentioned earlier. But they also have the potential to make the text of those real-world objects available to humans and machines. Since the text must be converted from an image, however, errors almost inevitably occur. the fact that Adobe Acrobat software lacks a Latin filter for its OCR function should alert you to the pitfalls of using Latin texts extracted from PDFs. In point of fact, however, it is possible to extract a usable Latin text from a PDF made from even a photocopy of poor quality. The following lines of Latin poetry were extracted from just such a PDF. So I have the edition on one side and the extracted text on the other, with some highlighted problems. But all things considered, that's a pretty good reproduction of the text in the original document. But why needlessly introduce new errors into a text that generations of editors have taken pains to free from the errors of copyists? Indeed, when we look at the text of the critical apparatus extracted from the same PDF, we find that the work of those editors is no longer meaningful. Nevertheless, a PDF can still fit our definition of digital Latin, since it contains data that can be read by both humans and machines, and it does leverage the unique abilities of those two kinds of readers. A simple text file containing the text of Calpurnius Siculus's bucolic poetry could be considered digital Latin. Text files do, after all, contain encoded text that can be read by humans and machines, and they can be used as data for text analysis applications. Indeed, one can learn a lot about Latin from a collection of text files. Decades ago, the Packard Humanities Institute's Latin CD-ROM demonstrated the enormous potential of text files as a tool for word searches. Today, we can use the techniques and methods of natural language processing to harvest information from those text files. For the purposes of this paper, I wrote a program using Python that reads in a small corpus of bucolic poetry texts, including Virgil, Calpurnius Siculus, and Nemesianus. It builds from it a model for predicting whether another text is a bucolic poem. Now, there's not a lot of call for such an application. Most Latinists can reliably identify a bucolic poem when they see one. But it helps to illustrate my point about leveraging the unique abilities of humans and machines. Since the model is based on a relatively small amount of text, it doesn't yield much beyond what we already expect. For example, it's not surprising to find words for poetry, musical instruments, springs, rivers, plants, trees, and livestock of various sorts in a bucolic poem. But this kind of distant reading can lead to interesting and surprising discoveries about Latin language and literature in general. I tested my model by comparing one of Boccaccio's bucolic poems to it. The most accurate model gave Boccaccio's poem a 97% likelihood of being a bucolic poem. But then I also compared the entire corpus of Lactantius's theological works with the model, and those texts had a 75% likelihood of being bucolic works. I assume that's because pastoral poems have much in common with biblical stories, especially considering the number of sheep, cattle, and other livestock that appear in both. I thought that Julius Caesar's commentary on the Civil War would not rate very highly, but it had a 97% rating. Again, that's probably because of the number of fields, trees, rivers, streams, and livestock that both corpora have in common. It's clear that my model is not very useful for detecting bucolic poetry, but it does yield insights into word usage. In any case, it is also clear that text files can qualify as digital Latin, especially when paired with robust tools for analysis, such as the Classical Languages Toolkit or the resources readily available from the Linking Latin project. On to a few words about markup languages. Latin texts encoded in hypertext markup language, or HTML, the language used for most web pages, are closer to what I originally had in mind as digital Latin. Like simple text files, HTML can be read by both humans and machines. A crucial difference from image files, PDF documents, and simple text files is that HTML also provides a reliable way of representing the structure of a text with multiple levels of headings and basic units such as paragraphs and lists. This means that HTML files can be navigated more easily by human readers and the machines that they use. Since they are also lightweight, easy to produce, and simple to maintain, they have great potential for longevity, and they can be made available to anyone with access to a computer and an internet connection. Of course, that is also true of images, PDFs, and especially simple text files. So HTML doesn't have much of an advantage over those formats. Moreover, the rules for using HTML are not very strict, which means that the structure and contents of HTML files can vary widely from site to site, or even on the same site. For example, the files at thelatinlibrary.com, still one of the most widely used resources for Latin texts, bear witness to multiple different encoding practices. Nevertheless, I don't hesitate to call the texts on that site Digital Latin. After all, they form the basis for much of the work currently being done with natural language processing and Latin texts, and hundreds of Latinists the world over use it as a quick reference in their research and scholarship. Latin texts encoded in extensible markup language, or XML, come the closest to what I have in mind for Digital Latin. Although there are many similarities between HTML and XML, XML encourages, even requires, a different mindset, a data-oriented mindset. That's because XML documents are first and foremost databases, and the data contained in them must comply with strict rules. In industrial settings, those rules are defined by developers for the purposes of the organizations they work for. Indeed, the X in Microsoft Office's docx file format stands for XML. If you examine a docx file, as I have here, you'll find that it's composed of many smaller XML files that contain the content and all of the instructions for formatting and rendering it on a screen or in print. Incidentally, all of those files were just produced for the purpose of one document whose contents are the words digital and Latin. Since anyone can define rules for using XML, we might expect to run into the same problems or worse that we see in HTML with its loose guidelines for usage. Fortunately, the Text Encoding Initiative maintains and develops the standard for encoding textual data in XML. With hundreds of elements for encoding practically any kind of textual information, the TEI standard is an excellent choice for anyone wishing to make texts available and accessible to humans and machines. For example, the Open Greek and Latin project and the Perseus project use TEI XML for the canonical versions of their texts. Other organizations can customize the TEI's guidelines for their own purposes. For example, the EpiDoc guidelines, they customize the TEI's guidelines for the purpose of encoding the texts and physical descriptions of documentary papyri and inscriptions. Since those texts have many things in common with Latin texts and manuscripts, we based the guidelines for the DLL's encoding on EpiDoc, but we also added many details for encoding the other parts of a critical edition. The aim of our encoding guidelines is to produce editions that are first and foremost functional databases. That probably doesn't inspire awe in scholars who instinctively reach for printed books for reading or research. That's to say, nearly all Latinists working in the field today. Indeed, it probably repels the large number of scholars who are generally happy using their computers for word processing, web browsing, and communicating with others, but nothing more. They don't want to learn XPath, XQuery, XSLT, Python, Java, or any of the other tools needed to interact with an XML document, and they certainly don't want to navigate the raw XML. And honestly, who could blame them? It may seem, therefore, that we've spent a lot of time and resources producing something that no one asked for and that no one plans to use. After all, we already have an efficient and effective system for communicating information about Latin texts in print. So what more is needed? In point of fact, I agree with that sentiment, at least to a certain extent. I still use printed critical editions because they're convenient, durable, and after years of learning how to use them, I find them to be efficient and effective tools for research. That's why I don't propose to replace traditional editions with digital editions. Rather, I wish to demonstrate how much more we can accomplish if we cultivate a data-oriented mindset towards the text we study. In truth, all critical editions are databases, and those that are published exclusively in print form are databases. In a sense, well, in the sense that they contain organized, structured information that a human can query. In one of our first meetings, we projected an image of a text on a dry erase board and marked up the different types of data we identified. That's the result of our exercise on the screen. And that was the first step towards the DLL's encoding guidelines. It was an intense morning, as you can see from Tom Elliott's expression. But what we have done with the DLL's encoding guidelines is to translate the visual cues of a printed edition into something that will make sense to a computer too. Our argument for cultivating a data-oriented mindset is that new vistas in scholarship await us if we can apply computational methods and techniques to the texts we have been studying for centuries. This is not to disparage the feats accomplished so far with books, but it can't be denied that computers excel humans when it comes to processing large amounts of information rapidly. So why not take advantage of the ready availability of computing power for the advancement of textual studies? Consider the years of work that go into producing a traditional critical edition in print. They culminate in a single product, a book. One can use a book in many ways, but a book it remains, and a book it always shall be. The same amount of scholarship, or to be honest, more, goes into producing a digital edition, but many more outcomes are possible since the data can be queried, formatted, and processed using a variety of technologies. Since my focus here is on the critical apparatus, let's remember from earlier in the presentation that a note in a traditional printed edition appears in small type at the bottom of the page, often with nothing to signal its connection to the main text. In a digital edition, we can encode variant readings with accompanying annotations about witnesses, sources, and context within the text itself. Encoded in this way, the apparatus criticus is not an afterthought, lingering at the bottom of the page, hoping to be noticed. Instead, it presents its information in situ, neutralizing the effect of the printed page. When visualized on screen or in a printable PDF, that separation reasserts itself for sure, but the underlying data are always available for examination. I'll now present 3 of the DLL's projects to demonstrate the potential of a data-oriented mindset towards critical editions. An LD-LT digital edition can be rendered in the dynamic viewer that Hugh Kalis designed based on his work on the Citation project. This viewer allows readers to evaluate textual variants in place by dynamically swapping them into or out of the main text. It also provides the user with access to tools for lexical and morphological analysis via the Alpheus plugin. Readers can also use filters to remove information that doesn't interest them, and since none of these interactions can alter the underlying data, it's always possible to reset the edition to its original form. Just to explain what's happening on the screen here, those dialog boxes on the right-hand side of the screen correspond to elements in the text that have information about them. Rolling over them will highlight the word in question. Clicking on them will bring up the actual entry in the apparatus, and then clicking on any of the variants will swap the variant into the text. A digital edition's data can also be visualized in novel ways that may yield new insights. My colleague Chris Weaver and his students in data visualization created a number of such views to demonstrate the potential of this visual approach to textual analysis. In one instance, the different sources for the text are plotted along the storyline of the text in general, and you can see where the stories that they tell about a text diverge and intersect. In another instance, pixels of different colors illustrate the degree to which a variant reading differs from the one in the text. The basis for these visualizations is yet another program that they developed to migrate the edition's data from XML to a tabular format and back. With the help of Huskey, I have developed a process for using extensible stylesheet language transformations to convert a digital edition's XML code into LaTeX, a language used for professional quality typesetting. That means that all of the elements of the edition can be assembled in a print-ready format familiar to readers of traditional critical editions. These three projects, the HTML viewer, the data visualizations, and the XML to LaTeX transformation, are examples of the scholarship that machine-readable editions can inspire in addition to the traditional philological scholarship that continues to yield important insights. The question, however, is who will do the encoding? There's no shortage of interest in digital critical editions, as long as someone else does the work. But when scholars see the hundreds of tags in an edition that has been encoded in XML, their enthusiasm for digital editions tends to diminish significantly. I can attest to the tedium of manually encoding all of the details in a critical edition. Writing the encoding guidelines and then encoding our pilot edition of Calpurnius Siculus's bucolic poetry taught my collaborators and me all about that. Incidentally, you may have noticed that all of the examples in this presentation come from Calpurnius Siculus. I figure all of that effort should be worth something. But it also taught us about some other important lessons, and it led us to develop some tools and techniques for overcoming many of the obstacles that prevent scholars from working on a digital paradigm. Although editors these days may use word processors and other digital tools to create their editions, those tools are oriented towards how an edition will look in print. Digital though they may be, such tools still aim primarily at print production. Some may recall the early days of inserting codes to produce italic or boldface text, but that's about as far as most scholars have gone when it comes to encoding texts. Yet, as I mentioned earlier, editors have been encoding their texts for centuries with typographical conventions, abbreviations, sigla, and other visual cues. Consider that angle brackets and other kinds of brackets and parentheses all communicate specific things about a text in a printed edition, and that their meaning might change from edition to edition. Depending on the context, italic type, bold type, and Greek typefaces can distinguish any number of other things. These conventions and all of the abbreviations and other symbols convey information to readers visually. It shouldn't be much of a leap to recognize that typing daggers on either side of a textual crux is equivalent to enclosing the problematic text in sic tags, or that typing square brackets around surplus text in a printed edition is the same as using surplus tags in a digital one. But as reasonable as that may sound, it's easy to become overwhelmed by the sheer number of tags and attributes that can accumulate rapidly in an XML document. Moreover, there can be no doubt that encoding textual data in XML can be tedious work. Fortunately, many texts are already available in TEI XML from various projects, so some of the work has already been done. Even if editors prefer to start from scratch, the visual encoding practices they already use make it relatively easy to automate much of the semantic encoding process for XML editions. Accordingly, Virginia Felkner and I have developed some applications that will encode paragraphs, variant readings, and all of the standard editorial symbols with a reliable 90% accuracy. That's yet another example of scholarship and technology developing as a result of taking a data-oriented mindset to Latin texts. Describing those applications and the process for using them would require a deep dive into the world of Python, regular expressions, and other technologies, and that's beyond the scope of my presentation here. But suffice it to say that we've made great strides toward reducing the tedium of encoding so that textual scholars can focus on issues that can't be reduced to an algorithm. This means that they can still prepare their editions in the word processor of their choice, provided that they're willing to make some changes in their approach to facilitate the automation process. Even so, someone must still check the results of the automated encoding and manually encode anything that could not be handled programmatically. That's a good thing, since it can help with another issue that prevents scholars from working on digital editions, getting credit for the work. How to evaluate digital scholarship is still an open question for many academic departments, particularly when it comes to assessing textual encoding as a scholarly pursuit. There is nothing particularly difficult or scholarly about marking up the structure of a basic text. For that matter, it's not difficult to encode a basic entry in an apparatus, especially if one is following established guidelines. After all, that's why a computer can be programmed to do those things automatically. But line transpositions and other serious issues in a text require the attention of a scholar. That is when encoding becomes scholarship, since deciding how to represent the textual data involves deep knowledge of the text. And since there are ways of assigning credit for the work directly in the encoded text, it is easy for scholars to show where their expertise came to bear on representing the text accurately as structured data. It's our hope that we will eventually see published notes on the encoding, just as we often see notes on the text. Anything to promote the recognition of encoding as a scholarly activity will encourage more scholars to consider a digital platform for their next editing project. I'm happy to report that work is underway on a number of editions for our LDLT. For the SCS, I'm working with Bob Castor to encode books 9 through 12 of Servius's commentary on Virgil's Aeneid. Work is nearly complete on Cynthia Damon's edition of the Bellum Alexandrinum, and Tom Keyline has also submitted a proposal for an edition of Ovid's Ibis. The MAA has also included a number of editions, including Andrew Dunning's working edition of the Miracles of St. Friedewald, Roberto Pesci's edition of the Tractatus de Diis Gentium et Fabulis Poetarum by Paulinus of Venice, and an edition of the Cartulary of Premontre undertaken by Heather Waka and Yvonne Seal. Through a partnership with the Lombard Press, the DLL has also published 2 items from Jeffrey Witt's Sentences Commentary Project. And if anyone is listening to this presentation and is interested in publishing an edition with the LDLT, please don't hesitate to contact me at the address listed on the final slide, which is coming up. In conclusion, I have demonstrated that digital Latin can be a capacious term that includes images, PDFs, text files, encoded data, and other things. In fact, the other part of the Digital Latin Library that I didn't touch on here today, the DLL catalog, concerns building a comprehensive linked open data catalog of all available digital Latin texts in whatever form they take. But that's a matter for another presentation entirely. My concern here has been to show that the digital in digital Latin really has to do more with the mindset of the person working with the Latin text than with the Latin text itself. Long before the invention of computers, textual scholars and those who benefit from their work were encoding and decoding structured data, but they weren't thinking in those terms. Now that we have computers, machines that literally think with us, to trace that word back to its Latin roots, if not its original meaning, we should at least meet them halfway by making those data available to them in terms that they understand. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sam. If you unshare your screen.
Certainly.
And those who are well dressed put on their video so we can see engaging in the, or could engage in the discussion. So that's much nicer for our guests to see who is talking, but only if you are, it's fine with you. Be aware this is being recorded and published afterwards. So thank you very much indeed. So this was a really fascinating overview about the work that have been doing since a couple of years in Oklahoma with all these associations and excellent colleagues. So this is really very important work which is connected to various of the projects that are hosted and executed at our center in Venice, but also if I look into the audience that are close to the heart of the activities at many digital humanities projects and centers. So I'm sure there are a lot of questions, comments. So this is an interdisciplinary seminar. So everyone also who is not at the core of textual criticism is invited to also make comments and ask very basic questions for understanding, but also to show maybe connections or analogies to other fields. But I'm sure we have also very specific questions. I mean, you are running through open doors here, so digital philology and digital textual scholarship. I don't think you need to convince many of us here that that's the way to go. Maybe we go into that direction. Is it enough or is it too much, or I don't know. So the floor is now open for everyone to ask question. Raise your hand or make a note in the chat. I'm opening now the chat and try to keep track of who wants to ask, say something. Long comments, it's always difficult for me to read, but I will go through it one after another. Yeah, so I see hands, but don't know what's the order. I start here in my left corner at the top. There's Daniel Kish, our visiting scholar from Budapest, and in the future already almost started in Barcelona, and at the moment working on the Catullus online project, which is very closely connected, and I think very interesting. So the recent developments, you have to attend our the second Euporia seminar on the works that Daniel has been doing with Daniele Fusi, our other colleague from the center. So as regards automation also of the digitization process and encoding of apparatus. So, but it's to Daniel the word to ask or explain what you have been doing. Okay, Daniel. Your microphone, sorry.
Sorry. Thank you very much, Sam, for this thought-provoking talk, and there are so many points that one might raise, and I am particularly fascinated by the fact that for all of us who have been working on digital critical editions, who have been preparing digital critical editions, encoding the apparatus is such a challenge. So you either dumb down the encoding, which is basically what I did in Catullus Online. The apparatus is just encoded as text, and it's not really machine readable, or not in the way in which one might want to. And it's articulated typographically, or you have an enormous amount of manual work to do. And I wondered, so my dream was, and I don't know whether it's naive, was that sometime in some place of the world, some part of the world, a group of researchers would create a machine or a digital platform that would make encoding the critical apparatus easier. Do you think this is feasible based on your work, or in general?
Yes, in fact, that's what some of the applications that I mentioned can do. It requires the editor to make some changes in how the apparatus is written out originally. For instance, when I was working with Cynthia Damon, she sent me basically a Word document that had line by line the entries for the different parts of the apparatus. And after looking at that, and that's often how people work, but after looking at it, we realized that it's very systematic in the presentation of the data, right? You've got a variant reading followed by manuscripts in a particular order, then possibly conjectures or modern editions. And then you move on to the next variant reading, and so on and so forth. And you might at the end get an editorial comment. Since most critical apparatus entries follow that format, it's not a big leap to convert that to a tabular format. You could put it into a spreadsheet, for example, with each column representing those kinds of information. And that's a rudimentary way of giving it some structure. But when it's like that, what our program does is it runs through the text and finds the lemata that are referred to in the apparatus, and it associates them with the correct row in the spreadsheet and then encodes them together. So as long as the data is in a structured format, it's very possible to automate most of that process. But as I said, you have to be willing to start with a structured form to begin with. But working with Cynthia, she has found that compiling her apparatus criticus in that way actually helps her think about what she's communicating. So she's found it to be a useful exercise, and it's even been helpful to show her students how those things work. So I don't know if that answers your question, Daniel, but it certainly is possible.
Yes, it does. Yes. It does. So my problem is that, as you know, critical apparatuses are regular, so they have a typographical and a logical structure, but the regularity is sometimes such that humans with our quite versatile problem-solving skills, we can understand it, but a computer goes haywire. So when you have, say, a variant attached to another variant, or not rooted into a lemma in the text, as you showed, or a double variant that Sam Huskey proposes this reading or as that reading, or anything like that. A variant that's qualified, that Franz Fischer says the reading should be this, possibly with some hesitation. So if you're a textual scholar and you have a nasty fantasy, then you can invent a long list of things that will confuse a computer.
That's right. Yes, and that's actually where I think the value of the automated encoding process really is, because it brings to the surface the value of what a human brings to the entire process. In fact, we've got a log routine that will, as the application is going through the various lines of the text, if it runs into something that it just can't figure out, it will create a message saying a human needs to pay attention to this spot. So, but we've been able to come up with some, I think, pretty sophisticated ways of handling some of those problems. For example, what do you do when a certain set of sources has a word in one line that's connected with a word in another line, but other sources do something different? And we've been able to handle that by doing a kind of swapping of information, saying, if this reading appears in this place in the text, this one has to appear also, but only if dealing with certain witnesses. There's a lot of logic involved in that kind of thing.
There's a first comment by Charlotte Rocher isn't the next step for the apparatus a direct link to the image of the manuscript? And this opens the whole horizon of materiality, visuality of the text witnesses. So this is an important point to make. And how does this reflect your model or your plans? I mean, you can't do everything, but the standards are increasing, and this is what we want.
Yes.
I don't know, Charlotte, if you want to elaborate on this a little bit further. Your microphone is on mute.
There.
Yeah, here you go.
Well, I've working on my inscriptions, of course, I give somebody the image and that's all nice and easy. I just suspect that people will become discontented with being told what you think you saw in that manuscript. It's
right.
very much about authority, and it's about the very attractive possibility that we are undermining authority all the time, which is a very good thing to be doing. It's the subversive aspects of digital humanities which are the most attractive. And I'm delighted that that's what you think you saw, but let's look at it. And I'm very aware of this simply because I show people next to my text the photograph of the stone, and they're going to look and they're going to say, she's completely wrong. Obviously, that's not an iota. And so I think it quite frightens people to lay themselves that bare.
I agree. And there's no reason why a person can't go ahead and link to a digital version of a manuscript if it's available. Our encoding guidelines make that a possibility.
Cool.
But it's not a requirement, since it might not be available. The other aspect of this, of course, is, as Franz said, you do have to set limits on what you do. Otherwise, things are just going to go haywire. But since the Library of Digital Latin Texts are available on an open basis, there's nothing preventing someone from taking that text and doing exactly what you're talking about, making a mapping to digital images. It's just getting the text out there to work with in the first place is really our number one priority.
Absolutely. At this stage, I think the other thing is it might help deal with the problem. Everybody digitizes their manuscripts now, to which the answer is, so what?
Right.
I mean, what are all these digital images of manuscripts for? What's the point? Why have you done it? And it seems to me that all these libraries who've very respectably done it, now they've done it for reasons like conservation, which are really good reason. But the interesting question is going to be, okay, so now what are people going to do with this stuff?
Right, exactly. And it is, as you said, extremely important to verify the primary sources and get a look at the artifacts or the objects that you're talking about, so that your readers don't have to rely on your word alone. But on the other side, there are also people who propose that we don't need critical editions. We just need access to everything possible, right? Which kind of gives you a drinking from the fire hose approach.
Yes, also it's about volume. It's fine if you've only got one exemplar. I mean,
right.
Absolutely fine, but when you've got lots. But I do think that it also is about enriching it's a linked data question, because it's also about enriching these museum and library holdings.
Exactly.
When I go to the manuscript, I'd like to be directed towards places that have used that manuscript. Otherwise, I'm just seeing a pretty medieval page.
Yes. And in fact, Jeff Witt, one of the collaborators on the project, built a way, he calls it the traveling imprimatur. It's a way of verifying that the transcription of a document that you might be looking at comes from something that has been peer reviewed through our process.
Yeah.
That way, you know, a museum or a library could make use of our texts once they're available as a way of certifying that this is what some professional scholar has said this manuscript says. So.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.
Before I hand over to Tim, who has an aching hand already, it's all raised a comment or a question here by Savino Rua, who's also present, I think, about the automation of Latin scholarships, or is this very much from the future? I don't know. Are you thinking of artificial intelligence, or if you want to evolve?
Yes.
Question.
Yes, thank you for giving me the floor, and thanks everyone, and thank you Mr. Huskey for the presentation. I'm not myself a Latin scholar. I come from the world of taxation, so it's a bit different topic, but I'm interested in automation, and I just wonder, you know, looking at your presentation, whether you have any comment on the possible effect that automated you know, scholarship might have on the jobs in the field, because, you know, if you look forward 10 years, and I think some of you already said it, we can have a machine editing the text. I wonder, you know, in 10 years' time, what is going to be the effect on Latin scholarship? Just maybe a provocative question, if you have any thought about it. Thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you very much. The impulse to create an automated process was to leverage the ability of computers to do boring things very quickly. Right? And they can't actually edit the text. I don't know if that will ever be a possibility. I sincerely doubt it, since so much of editing has to do with critical judgment and understanding of the text on a deeper level. So it would be fantastic if there were funding available and people available who want to encode thousands of variant readings in XML documents, but I don't think that's ever going to be a possibility. So making it simple to automate the really low-level kind of stuff in encoding a critical edition has been a priority, just so that we can get people working on texts in this way, and that they don't get frightened off by having to type 10,000 angle brackets to make an edition. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
Yes, absolutely it does. And just maybe for your information, I can tell you that a similar discourse is going on in tax administration, to the extent that we are trying to use automation to automate, let's say, the tedious tasks, and let the people do more expert judgment on things where you know, human can really make a difference. So thank you very much.
Yeah. The key point there is where humans make a difference, right? That's the best part. Mm-hmm. I'd
have a comment on this as well, but first, Tim, you have raised your hand. You are on mute.
Now my microphone is working, I hope so. Yeah, thank you very much for your very instructive and thoughtful presentation. Just today I had to manage the problem that I had to edit a text with different variants and not only spelling variants, but also different manuscript variants. And actually, I'm coming from the field of historical semantics, and I'm more interested in what was already mentioned in the idea, what are we doing with digital editions afterwards? So what can we do with them? And my first question actually concerns the idea of lemmatization. Do you know some kind of tools that are already able to lemmatize Latin texts that have been annotated so diligently like your texts? Because it seems to me quite difficult for taggers to understand all the different annotations, taggings linked to critical apparatuses, for example.
Yeah.
So this is the first question. The second question in the same line, you have mentioned some computational tools to actually to compute on these texts. I was also wondering if it's possible to use these kind of tools in the digital Latin library. And the third question is actually about the sustainability. And actually the question, how do you make sure that we have your wonderful work still in 5 years and 10 years and at best 10 years again?
Yeah, thank you. Those are great questions. As far as lemmatizing texts go, yeah, I take your point about the problem of variant readings and the nested nature of XML and all of that. The way that could be handled, if ever there were a massive corpus of texts in our library that are in XML, it's a trivial matter to extract the main text and leave behind the variant encodings if you wish. If you want just to do a top level distant kind of reading, it's quite simple to extract the main text and just work on that if that will suffice. The goal there being to have a very accurate representation of the text to begin with. I think that's related to your second question. I may have forgotten entirely what it was. Could you say it again, please?
It was about the other computational applications to calculate on the editions and to see these kind of
so with
these tables with the dots, and to see also the comparison, the text reuse, and how different texts differ from another.
Okay, right. So again, being able to extract that main text with a simple transformation of it would supply the data for being able to compute on a text like you're talking about. Currently, for example, the classical languages toolkit that I referred to earlier in the paper, the corpus that they use for doing a lot of their work comes from the latinlibrary.com, which is a collection of HTML texts. All of the HTML encoding is typically stripped out in the process of doing that, iterating over the text to find out linguistic information about it. So the same kind of thing is relatively simple to do. Our goal is just to provide a good critical edition as a data set that can then be used and reused in a variety of purposes.
So just to make it clear, you do not intend to include these other techniques into the digital Latin library. These are things that stay
guidelines for. I think it's our mission to do critical editions and to make high quality information available. The Classical Languages Toolkit and what they're doing at the Linked Latin project, both are excellent, and they're much better focused on that kind of work. Our goal would be to supply information for people to use with those projects, I think. And then I'm sorry, I've forgotten your third question too.
About the sustainability, just
yeah.
how do you make sure that your library will stay online?
Okay, so the editions themselves are code bases. So they're stored in a Git repository, a version controlled repository. That's the canonical version of the edition. It could be displayed in an HTML reader or as a PDF or whatever, but the data will live in a version controlled repository. And since XML is essentially a text file, as long as there are computers that can read text files, the edition data will be usable and available. And anyone who clones one of those repositories will then have a history of all of the work that went into producing that edition.
Thanks a lot.
Yep.
Here's a very simple question by Joel Calvis-Mackie, but I think this leads into a very interesting field, Joel, if you want to ask your question directly to Sam.
Well, hello. Thank you, Sam, for your presentation. And hello, friends. In developing the text alignment network, one of my own side projects, I developed a particular XML format to try to do the kind of work you're doing, and you have my deep respect because I've kind of set aside that part of it for a few years, thinking about a real problem, and I appreciate your thought, your reflections and experience. What happens when you encounter parts in the critical edition where you either don't understand the editor's annotation, or where you believe that he or she has misrepresented him or herself, partly because of the laconic form? And what got me set on the side was working on Aristotle's Categories and Minio Palualo's edition, where he says that a particular phrase might have been omitted by Andronicus and Boethius, testibus of Dexipo and Porphyrius. And you go to those sources, and actually there's no evidence that Dexippus or Porphyry doubted that those were missing. So I'm sure you've encountered these too, and I'd love to hear your anecdotes.
Yeah, some of the difficulty that you mentioned arises from the brevity that editors have been forced to employ when they're designing critical editions in print. We're hoping that this format that doesn't rely so much on, I'm sorry, are we having audio problems, or am I coming through okay?
I put myself on mute, maybe I'm causing the problem.
Okay. At any rate, I'm hoping that by removing the thinking about a printed fixed form, editors will be able to be more expansive in their comments, for one thing. But when you run across a comment like you have, where if you're encoding that text, you've got to figure out what it meant, the best you can do is then try to represent it in the way you think it makes sense, and then also add your comment to explain your argument. You can either do that directly in the text or through an XML kind of comment to say, this is my best guess. But I think that the problem that you alluded to is, or that you mentioned, is really more of an issue if you are encoding an existing edition, right? And our goal is to have editions that are created anew by editors who are working and doing the work themselves to decipher those kind of comments. Does that answer your question, Joel? Okay, great. Thank you.
That also is related to a general problem or option or future vision, or what is missing in your model, as far as I could see, is so you are still, even if the editions are new ones, what is missing is the record of the editorial process. So why has been a certain decision been made? Why is something a lemma and something else is just a reading that can be replaced? But so the critical work of the editor. So this could be made much more transparent and also expressed in a machine readable way. So as a base maybe for future automation of the critical process. I mean, I don't believe we will get there in the near future, but so that would be a vision. So to document and formalize editorial decisions and critical evaluation of readings, and this is something. So as far as I see, the editions or the model that you use for Digital Latin Library does not cover this aspect. Is this right, or am I mistaken?
Well, what I've been able to display to you today in this paper doesn't really go into the extent of an LDLT edition, but let me pull up something and share a screen with you. Is that okay? Okay.
Yeah.
So this is a PDF that was generated from Cynthia Damon's Bellum Alexandrinum, and we haven't encoded the preface yet, so it's just gobbledygook, but it does include descriptions of the manuscripts and the bibliography. But more importantly, as you get into the text itself, she has included some, let me see if I can find one really quickly here. She's included her own notes on the text in this edition, and they've been encoded as data linked to the passage. So for example, here, we get a full note on the apparatus criticus entries and the problems that she had trying to figure out what she was going to put into the text itself. So all of this is linked within the single XML file of the edition. And I think it eliminates the need to publish a separate volume of notes on the text or separate articles. And since they're all linked together within that one document, it's all there ready to be accessed. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, that's very useful, but that's still more the traditional way. So to have a philologic commentary explaining certain decisions, but what you want is to have this for each and every editorial decision. So every word, why this and not the other in the other witness. And this should always follow. So that's our ambition, to follow a concept, so an idea. So it's not arbitrary. So we can explain every decision. So that follows maybe the idea of a stemma, the reconstruction of an archetype, or whatever editorial decisions which need to be made transparent. Otherwise, it's not scholarly, or be transparent by custom, because we know how these editions or texts are established. And to have this as data so that we can use this. I mean, these commentaries need to be read and understood, and can only be understood by excellent scholars who are working in the field, but they are not machine readable in a way. But I mean, maybe this leads a little bit too far. So just to show this direction.
No, it makes a lot of sense. And I think we've gone a little bit in that direction, at least. Franz, let me, can you see some XML code on your screen now?
Yeah, I do at least, yeah.
Okay, so Bob Castor developed a tagging system for us to describe the different kinds of readings that can occur if you wish to use them. As a kind of shorthand classifying the different kinds of variants. So that at least starts to approach what you're talking about, right? You could make a list, for example, of all of the orthographical variants, for example.
Right.
And I can show you a practical use of that. Let me get to that. Here is a live, can you see a poem 1, Corydon and Ornitis?
No, right now we don't see.
Now?
Yeah, now something happened. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, and I'll just take the opportunity to demonstrate Hugh Kalis's great work here. So here are the apparatus readings that you can click on to see what's going on in a text. But also, if you're not interested in orthographical variants, for example, and a text has been encoded with that tagging system, you can check this box and those that have been identified that way will disappear. Or if you're not interested in morphological variants or lexical variants. So that's one way of leveraging this kind of machine readable tagging, but there's definitely more that could be done in that direction. It's just a matter of when does this cease to be within the scope of the DLL project, and when does it become something for someone else to do using the data that we make available, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Sam.
Yeah, thank you.
To Paolo with 2 or 3 questions. A comment here from Daniel that the copyright problems, or with reference to Charlotte's suggestion or with the requirement of connecting our textual resources with images and the material witnesses. Another comment from my part, of course, IIIF and also the ISME project, so identifiers for manuscript. These are all developments which will support an easier way to create connections, also in an automatic way of textual resources, critical annotations, reference to witnesses, and then to not having all the responsibility to collecting images that to check copyright issues, and so just to have a stable identifier, have a IIIF framework, and then so I mean that's something of the future, but which is already visible also in the editions of Jeff Witt, of course, and other tools that are created around these new standards. And also Tiziana Mancinelli, she's here among the participants. So these are really very important progression to make these connections, create distributed resources with all the materials that are out there and being created by experts. So those who take care of the archival material, librarians, and who make the photos, and the actual textual scholars, and so on, to have enable all this collaborative work. Just a comment. I think that's to many of us, this is known and they are familiar with this. But Paolo, if you want to go through your list of questions, I didn't get to, and I have to scroll down.
Yeah, what's interesting is that the talk is so interesting that you replied some of my questions, and now new ones are coming up because I see you using CTS. So thank you very much. Okay, the first question was on copyright, whether you are also encoding editions that are in print, and how do you deal with their copyright? The second one was on transpositions, encoding of transpositions, and how do you encode apparatus notes along the lines of what George said, that are just, you know, more discursive. They're not like delete this word or replace this word. And the third one was about non-substantial readings or orthographic readings, but I just peeked and saw that you have a check with like hide them. And the other one, it was about CTS. So you pick what question you have time to reply. Thank you very much.
Well, as far as the, and by the way, thank you very much, Paolo. It's nice to actually speak with you. We've corresponded before. So anyway, the first one, the question of the copyrighted editions, I'm hoping that that's not actually going to be an issue, because our mission is not to encode existing editions. This one, the Calpurnius Siculus, we did as a test edition so that we could have some data and have a sense of building the model for it. But as far as editions that we publish, the copyright is owned by the editor, and that way it's openly accessible, and they carry the copyright with them. But as far as encoding transpositions and other kinds of things like that, we lean heavily on attributes in the XML that tie elements together. So the TEI uses require as an attribute. So if something is, well, let me back up. If you have a line transposition and you don't account for it in the encoding, there's a possibility that you could end up displaying a text that never existed before, right? By giving a line printed in two different places, for example. So with a transposition, we'll include the attribute require, or its opposite, basically, so that whenever something that meets one of those criteria is displayed, the other things that are logically connected to it are also displayed, or those that aren't connected with it are never displayed. So that's how we're handling that kind of thing. And yes, we are open to including orthographic readings. That's been especially true of the medievalists who are submitting editions. As you know, classicists tend to have an allergic reaction to orthographical variants. So that's the editor's taste, really. But the framework is there to include those kinds of things.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
There is a simple question by Annette von Stockhausen about the provision of a stemma, but it's also connected to the formalization. So in a way, we want this also as formalized data connected to the decision making. So this is the justification. Annette, if you want to...
No, it's exactly what I meant. Yeah. I was adding to your question before about automation of variants, and the stemma is maybe, if you're in some way in a Lachmanian edition scheme, it's a part of doing the edition. So
right.
That's and I'm still struggling for the editions I do in the field of patristic studies. So it's a real question.
Yeah, no, it really is. As far as a graphical representation of a stemma, those we generally treat as just images, since those are things that make sense to a human being visually. But as far as the representation of a stemma in terms of structured data, that's where XML and its hierarchical system of coding comes in quite nicely, because you can have, for example, in the TEI's list of witnesses, a witness can be, one list of witnesses can be a child of another list of witnesses. So in terms of structured data, you can see the relationship of all of those manuscripts to each other. It's just not exactly practical to try to turn that into some sort of graphical representation, which is why we use an image if the editor's approach requires it. Does that
Yes, thank you. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Just taking here from my bag this. It's mirrored, so handbook of stematology. So that's a really excellent volume. So on this topic, stematology. Also an article of myself on the representation of text, which is not so important here. But, so it's online and edited, open access, edited by Philip Rowley from Zurich. So
wonderful.
As a reference here and a little bit of publication.
That's great, Franz. Thank you.
Yeah. Further questions from the audience? I'm not sure if I missed someone. Please raise your hand or just shout, put on your microphone. I mean, there are, as Paolo said, so many aspects that we are dealing with here.
It looks like Daniel.
Go ahead. Yeah, I'm waiting for your statement here. Daniel.
Okay. I thank you. I totally agree with your vision. That is, we strive for highly structured XML-based databases, which make explicit what was implicit in a paper edition, and potentially, of course, add much more to this. But and it is a giant leap forward. But these texts, as you have said, are very difficult to create, and that's a point we could not underestimate, in my opinion. So I'm thinking we should strive to provide a much higher abstraction level to design and fill our models with data without any constraints from an XML-based format. And so in this case, if we can create such systems, TI would be a product of a higher order database rather than the place where we are forced to put all our content up front. It will be an output like you have shown for some import processes. And I mean, you have shown to us how Word serializes its data in an XML-based format like OpenXML. But of course, that's not certainly the way Word internally handles them during editing. There's a more abstract model working there under the hoods, which just happens to be serialized into XML once it gets saved. So what do you think about it? Should we try to move TI from the start to the end of the workflow?
I like that question. It's a very important one because that what you're talking about, the higher level of abstraction is always on our minds when we're thinking about how to make it easier for people to work with this kind of text. I think I view an XML document as one method of presentation. It's not the only method of presentation, but it's one that makes some logical sense, and there's a nice infrastructure already available and a community of users that is responsible and has been doing a really great job of accommodating all of the needs of different kinds of texts. However, there are problems with it. The hierarchical nature of it is mostly able to handle the different problems that you run into with textual data. But there are times when I have not been able to figure out how to get something, how to represent some phenomenon. For example, if there's a word at the end of one sentence that is demarcated by a segment in TEI, and it's linked to another couple of words in the next segment, it is very hard to link all of those together since you are, in fact, jumping over a level of the hierarchy. So that's where TEI can fail. And there have been certain workarounds for that kind of thing. But I think, hardly anyone is going to want to interact directly with the XML itself, which is why the work that Hugh Kalis has done and the work that they've done at the Perseus project, for example, in visualizing TEI texts. I think that's so important because we're making it possible for people to interact with the data without having to think about what it really looks like. Does that at all get to what you're questioning, Daniela? You're muted.
Sorry. Yeah, I think that's the point. That is, we are often, at least in some cases, we should try to escape the cage of the hierarchy, the unique hierarchy imposed by XML. This one structure to take everything into itself and try to model at a higher abstraction level. Yep.
And in fact, that's what the visualizations that I referred to in my talk do. They read in the DOM of the XML, basically, and pulled out all of the data and converted it into a tabular database so that it doesn't have that kind of hierarchical difficulty. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. That's the point.
Yeah, I see here also a lot of room for collaboration. So Daniela is working on the Cadmus editor software, and also, I mean, the Proteus tool would be also relevant for. But this is I don't want to spoil the presentation on the Monday in 2 weeks, I think, on the refactoring of the Catullus edition. So Samuel, this is an obligatory seminar for you, I suppose. No, I mean they have done great work. So if you are available, I really recommend to visit this. Otherwise, I mean, this will be dispersed, also disseminated.
Yeah, I'm hoping to be at that one. Unfortunately I teach at that time, so I'll have to reschedule my students. But yeah, I'm really.
There will be recordings like all the time, but it's always nicer to be. At the same time. More questions. Here the notes. So recordings available on YouTube. So that is for our seminars, but also for the Autoporia series organized by Federico Boschetti. More questions, comments, suggestions? I mean, we could. I had the idea to. End on a political note. I was very disappointed, so from the European perspective, of course, that Oklahoma went to the Trump, it was a blue state in the end, and that tempted me to create an analogy. So because is there an analogy to Trumpism and to digital philology? So I mean, breaking the establishment, the loss of quality, diminishing of content. I don't know. So how do you feel your role in the established academic environment as a promoter of digital formats? Are you considered to be someone who is I don't know, lowering standards, or what is your personal experience in the field as a promoter of digital approaches and methodologies and publications, formats, and so on?
Thank you. That's
also not the Trump of digital, of traditional.
Thank you. I suppose. Making XML great again, I guess. But honestly, I've had a nice reception from people in, for example, the Society for Classical Studies. They've been very interested in the work that we're doing, eager to help out with efforts to get this kind of scholarship recognized as on the same level as other kinds of work. I think a lot of the reaction that I get is typically, well, that's really neat, but I don't know how to do that, so I'm not going to. And that's where there has to be a lot of outreach and training and willingness to work across different disciplines. I'm not sure if I'm really answering your provocative question, Franz, but I think there's definitely a potential for this kind of work to have a sort of renegade tone to it, with our emphasis on open access and open availability of resources. And it definitely causes deans and provosts to scratch their heads when they're looking for a book and you give them a link to a GitHub repository. But, this is the way we make progress. And I had the good fortune when I was chair of the department to have a policy on digital scholarship approved by the university so that we could start to make headway in making it possible for people to feel free to work in a different medium. So does that get to anything that you were trying to get to?
Absolutely. No, thank you very much.
Okay.
Yeah, so if there are no further questions, I mean, I'm glad you also mentioned, and we didn't talk much further about it, the crediting of the digital computing, the work, so which I'm glad you promoted as a chair of the department. It's as far as my experience go in Italy, it's very difficult to be credited for digital scholarship. So as regards the publication formats to publish code. So I mean, you can proceed your career in Italy only if you publish books, basically. I mean, things are improving and acceptance is growing, but it's still very, very difficult for digital scholars, excellent scholars to proceed in this new field and get the credits they deserve. So I think that's really something we should always mention at the end, or at the beginning and in the middle of these presentations, because we are all agree that here excellent work is taking place and scholarship progresses, and this needs to be, so we need to find ways of also crediting these works and achievements. So otherwise it's not very sustainable, especially for those who do the actual work.
Yeah, and that was my main motivation for working the XSLT to transform an edition into a printable book. If someone needs a book to show to an administrator for purposes of professional recognition, then that's possible. But it's just one possible presentation of the data. Yeah.
Also to credit the works of those who create the models or the software that is then doing this transformational processes. I mean, where we all rely on it, that needs really expert scholars of highest level, and so who understand both sides and have these particular skills. I think we all agree on this, but we have to express this everywhere we can, so that some day not too far, this people can then also follow their own career paths in our field.
Well, and you're a big part of that with your journal, with RIDE. It's an important part of that entire process, getting review out there so that people can see the work that's gone into those kinds of projects.
Yeah, and yeah, so I agree. So I'm proud of this initiative, and it's not only about the resources that are reviewed, the editions, the resources that are reviewed, to be reviewed really as digital resources, not just as something strange with some extra components, but also the review process itself. As so, I list these reviews always under research articles, so that it's not just giving a summary that's is contained by the edition and that's it. So these are really critical evaluations or snapshots of a state of digital research. So yeah, thank you for mentioning this, but I completely agree.
Yeah.